Use headphones for best experience.
The game doesn't start when you open the lid. It starts the moment you notice it. A bell you don't ring hums anyway, and the air thins like a held breath. You can play or you can pay, but you won't leave. The shop occupied a narrow slice of real estate between a defunct bookbindery and a cafe that served espresso to graduate students who could no longer afford to be graduate students. Claire noticed it first, the way she noticed everything that deviated from the expected pattern of her carefully ordered world, with a mixture of curiosity and mild annoyance that something had dared to be different. "When did that open?" she asked, pausing on the sidewalk outside Morlock's Antiquities. The window display featured an eclectic arrangement of objects that seemed to have no organizing principle beyond their apparent age. A tarnished silver tea service, a collection of leather-bound volumes with titles in languages she couldn't identify, and what appeared to be a Victorian mourning locket containing a photograph of a child whose eyes seemed to track movement on the street. David adjusted his glasses and peered through the grimy window. "Must have been recent. I walk this route every day to the office." He was the kind of person who noticed disruptions in routine with the anxious precision of someone whose life depended on predictability. "Let's have a look," said Marcus, already pushing open the door. The brass bell that announced their entrance produced a sound that seemed to linger in the air longer than physics would suggest, its tone rich and mournful. The interior smelled of old paper, leather, and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that Claire couldn't quite identify. Dust motes swirled in shafts of light that seemed to originate from no visible source, and the narrow aisles between towering shelves created the impression of walking through a canyon of accumulated time. Jennifer wrinkled her nose. "It smells like a funeral home in here." "Or a library that's been closed for 50 years, added Sarah, though she was already gravitating toward a display case filled with antique jewelry. Sarah had always been drawn to beautiful objects with complicated histories. The proprietor emerged from the shadows between two particularly tall bookcases as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. He was elderly but moved with a fluid grace that suggested hidden reserves of strength. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, and when he smiled, Claire felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Welcome to Morlock's," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been European but seemed to originate from somewhere more distant than geography would allow. "I am Edmund Morlock. How may I assist you this evening?" Marcus, ever the social coordinator of their group, gestured toward the others. "We're just browsing, actually. Having a little reunion, college friends catching up over the weekend." "Ah, old friendships," Morlock nodded approvingly. "There are few things more precious than the bonds forged in youth. Tell me, do you enjoy games? I have some quite unusual specimens." Before anyone could respond, he was already moving toward the back of the shop, his movements decisive and strangely hypnotic. The friends exchanged glances but followed, drawn by the same inexplicable curiosity that had brought them into the shop in the first place. The games occupied a glass-fronted cabinet in the shop's furthest corner, arranged with the same meticulous care as religious artifacts. Most were recognizable variations on familiar themes: chess sets carved from unusual materials, playing cards with intricate hand-painted designs, dice made from substances that might have been bone or ivory. But in the center of the display sat something different. The box was perhaps 18 inches square, crafted from dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Brass fittings secured the corners, green with age, and the lid bore an inscription in flowing script: "The Revels of Perdition, a game of chance and consequence for the adventurous spirit." "That one's rather striking," said David, though his voice carried an odd note of reluctance, as if the words had been spoken by someone else. Morlock's smile widened. "An excellent choice. One of my finest pieces. 18th century, possibly earlier. The provenance is interesting." "What kind of game is it?" Sarah asked, pressing closer to the glass. "A party game, essentially, designed for intimate gatherings of friends. The rules are quite simple, though the entertainment value is..." Morlock paused, searching for the correct word. "Substantial." Claire found herself strangely drawn to the box, though she couldn't articulate why. The wood seemed to pulse with its own inner warmth, and she could have sworn she heard something. Not quite music, but a rhythmic pattern that might have been breathing, or might have been the subtle creaking of old wood settling in its joints. "How much?" Marcus asked, though Claire could see in his expression the same inexplicable compulsion she felt herself. "For you, my friends, a special price. Shall we say $200? It was more than any of them would normally spend on an impulse purchase, but somehow the price seemed reasonable, even inevitable. Marcus was already reaching for his wallet before the others could object. As Morlock wrapped the game in brown paper tied with string, he leaned closer to the group and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "A word of advice, if I may. The game rewards commitment. Once begun, it should be completed. To abandon the Revels before their natural conclusion would be unwise." Claire wanted to ask what he meant, but the bell above the door was already chiming their departure, and somehow the question seemed less urgent once they were back on the familiar sidewalk. They returned to Jennifer's apartment, a spacious loft in a converted warehouse that she'd inherited from an aunt with theatrical inclinations. The space felt appropriate for their reunion, dramatic and slightly eccentric, with enough room for the kind of elaborate socializing they'd enjoyed in college but rarely had time for anymore. Jennifer opened a bottle of wine while the others arranged chairs around her dining table. The brown paper wrapping fell away to reveal the game box in its full splendor, the dark wood gleaming under the apartment's track lighting. "It's heavier than I expected," Marcus observed, lifting the lid. Inside, the game components were arranged in fitted compartments lined with midnight blue velvet. A folded sheet of parchment contained the rules, written in the same flowing script as the box's inscription. Beneath the rules lay a deck of cards, their backs decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally. David picked up one of the playing pieces, a small figurine carved from what looked like black stone. As his fingers closed around it, he made a small sound of surprise. "It's warm," he said, though when the others touched their own pieces, the stone felt cold as winter. Claire unfolded the rules and read aloud, "The Revels of Perdition is a game of chance and consequence for 5 to 7 players. Each participant selects a token and places it upon the starting position. Players take turns drawing cards and following the indicated instructions. The game concludes when only one player remains, or when all players have achieved their final destination." "That's oddly ominous," Sarah commented, though she was already claiming one of the stone figurines, a graceful female form with arms outstretched as if dancing or drowning. The game board itself was a work of art. Crafted from the same dark wood as the box, it depicted a winding path through what appeared to be a landscape of increasing desolation. The starting point showed a pleasant garden scene, complete with fountains and flowering trees rendered in minute detail. But as the path progressed, the scenery became progressively more disturbing. Withered plants, crumbling architecture, and finally, at the far end of the board, what looked like an open grave surrounded by mourning figures. "Cheerful," Jennifer muttered, but she was already positioning her piece on the starting square. They began to play as the wine flowed and conversation filled the spaces between turns. At first, the game seemed innocuous enough. Draw a card, move your piece, follow the simple instructions printed in elegant script. Advance 3 spaces. Take a moment to appreciate the beauty around you. Share a happy memory with your companions. But as the evening wore on and their pieces progressed along the winding path, the cards' instructions became more complex, more personal, and somehow more unsettling. Claire drew a card that read, "Confess a secret you have never shared with these friends." She hesitated, the wine making her tongue loose but some deeper instinct urging caution. Finally, she admitted to a brief affair she'd had during her marriage, something she'd never told anyone, not even her therapist. The confession felt good, cathartic even, but she noticed that the others were watching her with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to the revelation. More unsettling was the way the stone figurine in her hand seemed to pulse with warmth, as if feeding on her disclosure. David's turn brought an instruction to describe your greatest fear in vivid detail. He spoke haltingly of his terror of drowning, of the way water seemed to call to him with malevolent purpose. As he talked, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and Claire could have sworn she heard the distant sound of waves lapping against an unseen shore. Sarah drew a card that commanded her to look into the mirror of truth and describe what you see. There was no mirror visible, but Sarah's eyes fixed on the apartment's darkened windows, as if she were seeing something reflected there. Her voice became distant and strange as she described a woman aging rapidly, her beauty dissolving like sugar in rain, her body collapsing into decay and dissolution. Marcus was instructed to feel the weight of every life you have touched. He began to weep uncontrollably, though when the others asked what was wrong, he could only shake his head and whisper apologies to people they'd never heard him mention. Jennifer's card bore the simple instruction, "Remember," she screamed. The sound cut through the room like breaking glass, and suddenly everyone was looking at her with expressions of dawning horror. The memories were returning, not just to Jennifer, but to all of them. This wasn't the first time they'd played this game. They'd been here before, in this room, around this table, with these cards and these cursed stone figurines that grew warmer with each confession, each moment of psychological destruction they were compelled to endure. "How many times?" Claire whispered, though she was beginning to remember the answer herself. The game reset after each completion, drawing them back again and again like addicts to their preferred poison. Each playthrough wiped their memories of the previous sessions, leaving only a vague compulsion to return, to purchase the game again, to gather their friends for another evening of entertainment. But the memories were fragments now, broken pieces of repeated experience. She remembered David drowning in his own bathroom, water pouring from fixtures that shouldn't have been connected to any plumbing. She remembered Sarah aging decades in minutes, her flesh withering as her stone figurine grew hot enough to burn. She remembered Marcus collapsing under the weight of guilt so profound it stopped his heart, and Jennifer screaming herself to death as forgotten traumas crashed back into her consciousness. And she remembered her own death again and again, each time different but always inevitable, always the price demanded by the game's malevolent intelligence. "We have to stop playing," David said, though even as he spoke the words, his hand was reaching for the deck to draw his next card. The game wouldn't let them stop. The rules were absolute, and they had agreed to play by accepting their pieces, by making their first moves along that terrible path. The stone figurines were burning hot now, but none of them could release their grip. The cards seemed to draw themselves, floating from the deck to their hands without conscious volition. The instructions became more direct, more vicious in their specificity. "Feel your lungs fill with water," Claire read from her card, and immediately began to choke and gasp as phantom liquid flooded her airways. She fell from her chair, convulsing on Jennifer's hardwood floor as her friends watched in helpless terror. David's card commanded him to age as you have feared to age, and his hair turned white as his skin wrinkled and his bones became brittle. He collapsed into dust and memory, his stone figurine clattering onto the board with a sound like distant thunder. Sarah was instructed to bear the weight of every sorrow you have caused, and the guilt that crushed her was so profound that her heart simply stopped, overwhelmed by the accumulated pain of a lifetime of small cruelties and casual neglect. Marcus drew the card that read, "Pay the price of your deepest shame," and whatever he saw in his mind's eye was so terrible that he began to claw at his own face, tearing flesh and screaming until his voice gave out and his movements stilled. Jennifer, the last to die, was given the instruction she had received in every previous iteration of this nightmare: remember everything. The memories crashed over her like a tsunami, not just of their repeated deaths, but of the game's history, of all the previous groups of friends who had purchased it from Morlock's shop, who had gathered around tables like this one, who had played until there was nothing left of them but empty chairs and stone figurines returned to their starting positions. As Jennifer's consciousness finally shattered under the weight of accumulated horror, the game board began to glow with its own internal light. The stone figurines moved of their own accord, gliding back to their starting positions. The cards reshuffled themselves and returned to the deck. The box closed with a soft, satisfied sigh. By morning, the apartment was empty except for furniture and the faint smell of old paper and something sweetly organic. The game sat innocuously on the dining table, waiting. Within a week, it would be back in Morlock's shop, placed carefully in the display case among the other unusual specimens. And eventually another group of friends would notice it, would be drawn by its dark beauty and mysterious promise of entertainment. Edmund Morlock would smile his colorless smile and speak of the game's substantial entertainment value. He would wrap it carefully in brown paper and offer his gentle warning about the importance of completion. And the revels would begin again, as they always had, as they always would.
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.